I want to see if I can say something here about attachment theory, which is a very important kind of model for making sense of human relationships and intimate relationships. Attachment is a term that describes an emotional bond initially between an infant and their primary caregiver or caregivers, and later on in life between intimate partners or continuing relationships with family members or best friends or what have you. One of the ways of thinking about this, okay, is to, well, just to describe it in sort of a developmental context, and that's kind of what I'm going to do here today, okay? And if we go right back to the beginning, right, when an infant comes into the world, an infant is absolutely helpless, absolutely dependent on their primary caregivers, not only for their physical well-being and survival, right, being able to provide food for them, being able to provide safety for them, roof over their heads, and so on, but also for their emotional well-being. So when a child or when an infant is in emotional distress, okay, it's almost a gut reflex and an instinct to want to pick them up and to try to comfort them in some way, okay? And we do that by holding them close, and ideally, as long as we're not sort of anxious or tense in our role as a parent or as a caregiver, we're comfortable, relaxed. The infant's body sort of feeds off of that energy. We tend to make eye contact with them. It's very hard not to look into the eyes of an infant, let alone an infant that's in distress. And we'll talk sort of in this kind of soothing, nurturing tone of voice. And we know that there's something about all of those things. As long as that infant isn't, hungry or excessively tired or needing a diaper change or something, there's something about that works. And you don't need to be a psychologist to know that. You don't even need to be a parent necessarily to know that. It almost comes quite naturally to most people. And so there's something about that works. Now what's curious is that very early on with infants, there have been studies that have been done that shows that infants who are in distress, if you put sugar water on their tongues, it will in many cases calm them down. But at a certain point, around 1 or 2 months of age, the sugar water trick doesn't work anymore. But what does work is sugar water plus eye contact from the mother, or presumably the father, if the father is very involved, very engaged from the outset. Now what's happening, we believe, from a neurophysiological point of view, is that with that eye contact, that comforting way that a parent touches and comforts their infant, that soothing tone of voice that the infant quickly identifies as being the voice of the parent, with all of those things, there are endogenous opiates being released in the nervous system of that infant. That's your body's natural painkillers. And dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter involved in pleasurable sensation, elation, and so on, is being released in the neocortex. And if there's only one thing I think that's quite helpful to understand about human neurophysiology, it's this. It's the idea that neurons, the cells in your nervous system, neurons that fire together wire together, okay? So as they activate together, they strengthen their connections in such a way that they create these functional neural networks, all right? So if we apply this to the following analogy, okay, we imagine that over here somewhere there's an infant and they're in distress. So their body is sort of this chaotic neural firing, all right? And a parent picks them up and comforts them, all right? And through just using their body, they use their body to move the body of that infant from a state of distress to a state of calm, using the eye contact, the tone of voice, the comforting touch, and so on. We imagine that happening not just once, but repeatedly, consistently, over and over and over and over again. And what's happening is that the nervous system of that infant is learning in a way, it's kind of like muscle memory for neurons, it's learning to shift from a state of random chaotic firing into a state of relative calm and equanimity. And this is the very beginnings of what we call emotion regulation. It's a very important part of understanding human attachments, all right? Now if we fast forward this a little bit and we go to the age of a toddler. So a toddler is about 2 years of age, and as many people know, they're learning language, but their receptive language is developing much sooner than they're expressive. They understand a lot more than they can say at this time. All right. Now we imagine that toddler feeling, an emotion. So again, we're biologically hardwired to have emotions, but how they're experienced and in what ways they're expressed or even acknowledged is something that is in many ways shaped or learned. So we imagine that toddler, and the toddler is feeling sad. And you can tell because the tears are streaming down their cheeks. Their head might be hanging a little bit low. The shoulders are hunched over. And any caring parent is able to identify that their child is in a state of sadness or distress. Now, ideally, what happens in a perfect world, and just so people know, this only happens, according to the literature, only about 50% of the time. Okay, what happens is a parent will come down on one knee at eye level with the child. They'll put an arm around them. They'll try to comfort them physically if need be. But now with language, there's something more that's happening. There's something that's added to this sort of process. Now a parent ideally is asking, "You look really sad. Are you okay? Are you upset because your brother took your toy away? That really wasn't fair. I wonder if you might even be angry. That would be okay. I wonder if you're upset, that we promised that we were going to go on this family trip and that we didn't get to go. And I know how excited you were." And notice with this kind of thing, it requires a parent that has a really high emotional intelligence to do this sort of wondering game, to wonder what their child is experiencing. Okay. Now what's happening is that in addition to all those physical ways of receiving comfort, the child is now, with language, they've heard these words maybe being tossed around. They haven't necessarily applied them to themselves. They're hearing these words and maybe they're shaking off the inquiries that are missing the mark. But at some point, the parent gets it right, maybe. And at that moment, the child senses that there's someone else that sort of gets it. It's almost magic to a kid, right? It's not magic to an adult, but it is almost to a kid because you've reached inside them. It's like you've somehow read their mind, you've gotten inside of them, and you've put this label on this subjective experience that only they know. And in that moment, they feel like someone else gets it. But even more than that, when the child is looking into the eyes of the parents and the child is feeling sad, and they sense that a parent is feeling something too, right? And the parent is feeling, as long as they're connected to their emotions, the parent is feeling for their child. They're empathizing, right? They're feeling the child's sadness. And so the child gets to experience themselves being felt by another person. And it's that feeling felt, that allows the kid can literally see themselves being felt and see that their emotions matter to someone else, that they matter to someone else. And this creates, this emotional bond, and it creates a sort of holding environment where it allows these feelings, these emotions that are almost unbearable in isolation, they now become, bearable. And if a kid has these kinds of experiences with a primary caregiver, this kind of nurturing, kind of connected experience, then it almost becomes, just intuitive. It becomes natural. It just becomes part of what they do, such that, when they're upset or distressed or worried, they'll tend to go to the primary caregiver, especially if it's something a little bit overwhelming that they can't deal with on their own. And it becomes normal. And when they grow up, they become adults. They can be vulnerable, they can let their guards down, they can be kind of aware a little bit of what they're feeling, they can express it to another person, someone who's close to them, and they do expect that person is going to care about what they're feeling and help them with it and connect with them around it. And it allows them to kind of feel a sense of emotional closeness with other people, even in adulthood. So if we go back to the beginning, with the toddler, and we remind ourselves, well, this only happens about half the time, so what happens in the other half of the time? Well, something different tends to happen. So we imagine that toddler feeling, upset or sad, stressed, and maybe an arm doesn't come around them. And they wouldn't know that one's supposed to, because as far as they know, that's just the way the world works, right? Maybe they're told, well, you don't have anything to cry about. Other kids have it far worse than you do, right? I'll give you something to cry about. Some parents get really frustrated with their kids being upset or sad. And this is really awful because it teaches a kid, that their feelings are not going to be received well. It teaches them to maybe, internalize their emotions, to, take a stoic attitude to them. Sometimes parents will get a little bit uncomfortable when their kid is feeling something. They'll try to fix the problem, okay? And parents will do this by saying, oh, well, why cheer up, it's not so bad, and let's look at this thing over here, and why don't you go play with those crayons, or why don't you go play outside, that'll kind of distract you or keep you busy, and so on. And this, this sounds like it's relatively benign, but in some ways it can actually be harmful because it teaches a kid to distract themselves from their feelings. They regulate affect by avoiding it, right? And so as adults, what they'll do is when they're dealing with a lot of stress and problems, they'll throw themselves into their work. They'll, engage in other activities to try to distract themselves, but they're never addressing the underlying issues. They're never, looking at them in any depth. Sometimes what will happen is, and those individuals, by the way, they tend not to be vulnerable. They tend not to reach out to others. They tend to be somewhat isolated in how they deal with emotions. They prefer to deal with things on their own. It's their partners, if their partners have a secure attachment style, their partners will usually say, you seem really distant, you never open up with me, you never talk to me about what you're feeling or what you're thinking in any deep way, and so on. We go back to the beginning again, okay? Sometimes what happens is, a parent won't necessarily say or do anything, but there'll be, sometimes conflict between parents, or sometimes a sibling, creates a lot of stress and strain in the family atmosphere. And this creates a lot of tension in the environment. And the kid will sometimes pick this up intuitively. And they'll sense, they won't think it necessarily, but kind of what's going on a gut feeling level is, I don't want to if I talk about my feelings, I don't want to make it worse for mom and dad. I don't want to create more problems. I don't want people to fight, or maybe my problems aren't that big because there's this other big stuff going on right now. And so what happens is that the kid feels a sense of anxiety about their feelings. They second guess themselves, they question themselves, and when they make it to adulthood, what happens is they do much the same thing. They'll kind of, sit with things and worry about things, and they'll never bring things up, or they'll be very reluctant to bring things up because they don't want to be a burden, or they don't want to inconvenience someone. And so they kind of had a sense of kind of walking on eggshells much of the time with their own emotions. They're often insecure in relationships, so they'll need a lot of reassurance from their partner. Are you sure things are okay? Are you sure that you love me? And so on, to feel okay. Now, these are some of the different trajectories or different ways, and there are many, many ways, but this is just a very rough sketch to get a sense of how attachment styles or styles of emotion regulation, can lead to different issues in relationships. So ideally, what we want to do is we want, like, if there is a history, so there's 50% of the general population who has less than a perfect, childhood, or a good enough childhood even. So we want to find ways of sort of overcoming, our past. And it's not to look back and to put blame on our parents or anything like that. We have to remember that our parents were children at one point too. But what we want to do is we want to acknowledge, our past, emotional hurts or pains or longings or whatever it is, and not to blame, but to sort of explain perhaps, some of our own difficulties in recognizing our own feelings, our own difficulties in being vulnerable in relationships. So hopefully that gives a sense of what attachment theory is and how we might make sense of this sort of thing.